joined by my colleague Liz Isaacs this morning, also from Housing Innovations. And I think everybody knows us, but just in case you don't, we are the consultants for the Connecticut Balance of State Continuum of Care, and are working with Alice at looking at our project-based rental assistance portfolio, and looking at opportunities to perhaps convert some of those projects to sponsor-based rental assistance. And we will talk more today about what that means and why one might want to do such a thing. But if you are from an agency this morning that does not have project-based rental assistance, you probably want to hop off, because there's nothing that we're going to talk about today that's going to be relevant or helpful to you. So I invite you, if you have mistakenly joined us this morning, to hop off and spend your next hour doing something else, maybe taking a walk. So Alice, I think you joined. Is there anything you want to say before I hop in?
I want to thank everyone for coming and apologize for being late. It's been and now that my dog is drinking water, you can hear that. It's been a little bit of a wild week, so I do thank you all for coming. And Lauren's right. If you don't have a PRA or SRA in your community, feel free to spend the time before it rains doing something outside.
Thanks, Alice. So just a couple really quick housekeeping things before I jump into the content here. So the slides for today, as always, are up on the CT Boss website, and Liz will get them up into the chat in just a minute, so you can also download them from the chat. We are recording this morning, and the recording will be posted on the CT Boss website, excuse me. So everyone is muted. When you join, you're automatically muted, but we absolutely invite you to ask questions, make comments. This is always more interesting if I'm not the only one talking. So I get tired of hearing myself talk also. So please unmute at any time and ask questions, or if you'd rather, you can also use the chat feature in Zoom. Liz will monitor the chat and we'll answer any questions that we get in the chat box, and also out loud for everyone, so that if you've only joined us by phone, you also can hear the questions and answers that are going on in chat. So we're scheduled to end. We scheduled this for 90 minutes, but we really don't have that much content to go over with you guys. So I think we will end early, but we just wanted to make sure we had enough time so that we could answer all of your questions. So depending upon how many questions you guys have, we are very likely to end well before 11:30. And I think that's all the housekeeping stuff. So I am going to move us into the slides. So this is our agenda. We've already accomplished number one, welcome and introductions. We're going to talk about just the basics for what project-based rental assistance, or PRA, and sponsor-based rental assistance, or SRA, are. We're going to talk about why we're doing this, right? Why are we even considering converting projects from PRA to SRA? We're going to go through the ways in which PRA and SRA are the same, and they're mostly very, very similar. There are just a couple of key differences between the two, and then we're going to talk about what those key differences are for an SRA project that will work differently than what you're already used to in PRA. And then we're going to talk about next steps. And then, as I said, you don't have to wait until the end to ask questions. If you have a question at any time, please jump in and ask that question. So there's a technical thing in Zoom from Susie. Liz.
Yeah, I just saw that. So I don't think you're next. We're still on the first slide.
I advanced the slides. So on my screen, it looks like their slides are not advancing.
No, we're on the first.
It actually, on my screen, just says Lauren Peretti has started screen sharing.
Yeah, I'm going to stop the share and restart it. I don't know. So apparently Zoom is not playing nice this morning. I do not know why. How about now?
Yep.
Okay. All right, let me know if there's another
Yeah.
problem and thank you, Susie. All right. So, so this slide just shows, you know, the basics about what PRA and SRA are. So, right, so PRA, project-based rental assistance, that's what you guys are doing now. So, you know, your nonprofit, right, owns a building, and you are leasing the units in that building to COC participants who are getting subsidies through the COC program in order to afford housing in your building. And under the PRA model, if a participant wishes to move out of your building, of course, everyone's always willing to move. It's not a prison, they can move, but they can't take the rental assistance with them, right? So in reality, for the folks that we serve, because they are, you know, low income folks, they don't have the option usually to move out because they need the rental assistance in order to be able to afford the unit. So in sponsor-based rental assistance, right, what you're doing in your building stays the same, right? You're building, you know, you're leasing those units to COC participants, and you're getting a subsidy to support the rent in that building, you know, through the COC program. But one key difference is that under the SRA model, participants can retain their rental assistance if they move on. Now that's going to be contingent on whether or not there's sufficient dollars in the grant to enable that to happen. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So why are we doing this, right? So in CT Boss, and I should have said, I'm sorry, I think we also have some folks from ODFC on. So welcome to our friends from ODFC. I'm going to be talking primarily about CT Boss because that's what I know, but we're glad that you were able to join us today. So we in CT Boss, we're always talking all the time, and I'm sure you guys are too in ODFC, about how important it is to spend every COC dollar that we get, right? Because every dollar, if at the end of your grant year, there are dollars that remain in the contract, right? You don't draw them down, or DMIS in this case doesn't draw them down in locks, right? That money goes back to the federal government, right? And it doesn't even get to be used by homeless people in other places. It just goes back into like the federal kitty and gets used for God only knows what, right? So we want to always hold on to all of our COC money so that so that we can use that money to house homeless people, right? So that's one of the primary things that's really driving this, is making sure, because we did a little bit of an analysis in CT Boss, and what we saw was that we've made tons of progress towards not having underspending, right? People are getting very good at spending their entire grant, but that the place where we still had underspending was in these project-based rental assistance projects. Because unlike in a scattered site program, right? In a scattered site program, if people know that they're going to have extra money in the grant, which, you know, usually happens, it can happen for a number of reasons. Often it's because, you know, there were vacancies, or you've got tenants with income and the tenant's paying a share of the rent, right? So, so what happens in scattered site projects is those projects are able to say, oh, I have enough money, let me lease another unit, or let me lease another 2 units, or let me lease another 5 units. But for you guys in project-based rental assistance, your building is your building, right? There aren't more units in that building for you to be able to lease. So you're not able to do that same thing. And so understandably, there's been more underspending in the project-based units than there has been in the scattered site units. So that's one reason, an important reason why we're thinking about doing this, right? The second reason is because, you know, we're all about, and we know that you guys are all about, tenant choice, right? We want people to be able to choose where they live, and this expands our ability to be able to offer people different housing choices. And then it also creates housing, and we'll talk more about this, but if under the SRA program, any units that you would lease in the community, right, scattered site units that you would lease beyond what's in your congregate project, those would be leased through a master leasing situation, which enable, and I'll talk more about what that means, which enables people who otherwise couldn't get a lease with a private landlord because they have bad credit, or, you know, they have terrible, you know, criminal justice history, eviction history, whatever, all those housing barriers, that those folks would have an option to live in scattered site housing, even though we can't find a landlord who's willing to lease to them. And I'll explain that. So, so this slide really shows all the ways in which PRA and SRA are the same, right? So, unfortunately, the bad news is that if you choose to do this, there will be no more money coming in from HUD, right? The amount of your HUD grant stays the same. So doing this doesn't change that. And it also doesn't change the number of applicants that you're going to commit to serving in the project application, right? So even, let's say today in your building, you've got 20 units, right? And you think that you may have enough money to be able to lease 2 additional units in the community. And now you've got 22 people. You're still going to put 20 on your project application because we don't want to lock you in to those additional 2 people, right? So you can always overlease on a HUD application. You start to get into trouble if you're under what you say you're going to do on your application. So it's not going to change what you put on your project application, all right? What happens in your building stays the same, right? You're still going to lease those units to COC participants, and DEMIS is still going to pay their portion of the rent to you, and the participant's going to pay their portion of the rent to you. So that stays the same. And then the requirements stay the same, right? So all the, like the HUD things that you have to do, right? HQS, housing quality standard inspections, rent reasonableness determinations, you know, you still have to do those things at least annually. You still have to determine and document people's income annually or whenever their income changes. You still have to recalculate rent. The rules for how rent is calculated, all that stuff stays the same. So the basic kind of, you know, regulatory structure for the 2 programs is the same. They're really just a couple of differences. So you guys are seeing the slides advance, right? Okay. So, so the key difference between PRA and SRA, that's what we're going to go over, right? So the first one I already talked about, right? So if converting to SRA allows the SRA participant to retain the rental assistance if they move out of the congregate project and into a scattered site unit, right? So it allows you to master lease units in the community if you've got sufficient funds to do that. And so when I say master lease, what I mean by that is that it works a little bit differently than what we're used to in Connecticut. So it's not a tenant-based rental assistance subsidy. It's a sponsor-based rental assistance subsidy. So what that means is that you, the nonprofit or the sponsor, right, you master lease units from landlords in the community, and then you sublease those units to COC participants, right? So, and that's what I'm saying. That's why it enables people who may not otherwise be able to obtain a lease. It enables those people to be able to get a lease in the community, maybe because they're not renting directly from a landlord, they're renting from you, right? You're renting from the landlord, then you're subleasing to them. So the sublease, you don't have to find a landlord that's willing to rent to them because the sublease is between you, the nonprofit, and the tenant, right? And then again, so I think I said this already. So then in those units, right? So this is a little different than what you're used to. You would then, you know, the tenant pays you, DEMIS pays you, that's the same, right? But then you have to pay the landlord the full rent. So that's how the master leasing thing works. Any questions before? Okay, so a question came up in the chat box. It's a good question. If we hold the lease, wouldn't we then be responsible for damages? Yes. So if you hold the lease, you're going to be responsible for damages. And so you remember though, that you can pay for damages out of your COC grant. So you can pay for, I will look this up, but I think it's up to 2 months. Go ahead, Susie.
We got into this, the reason I bring this up is we had the rental assistance instead of leasing. No, we had leasing instead of rental assistance with one of our grants. And we had a tenant move out that owed a lot of damages. And it was more than HUD would allow us to pay. And so they then expected, the landlord still expected us to pay, or else they were going to sue us. And that's why I'm asking, if HUD still limits the damages, how do we?
Yeah, so HUD does still limit the damages, I believe. So I know that they still limit the damages. My question in my head, I believe it's up to 2 months of damages.
Right, 2 months plus, I think you can have the 2 month security plus the 1 month
Exactly.
additional damage. So the most is 3 months.
There you go.
And this person owed about 6.
Yeah.
And we were on the hook for the amount over that what HUD would pay. So
Yeah.
has that changed, or is there a way to
No,
mitigate
that's
that?
not changed. That's still the same. That's still the same.
Because there's no
So-
way to insure it. We were able to insure with renter's insurance, but we couldn't insure that.
Yeah. So one of the things that people do, a couple ways that programs handle that, right? So one way is that the program makes the repairs themselves, hire somebody. Obviously, you're not going to go out and make the repairs yourself, probably, Susie, but you hire somebody to make the repairs to the unit yourself so that then you can control the costs on that. The other thing that people do is like a risk mitigation fund, right? So that there's, private funding or, some risk mitigation pool that allows you to draw from that pool in order to pay for damages. But you're right, that is, if you're signing the lease, you are going to be responsible. You're going to be responsible for the damages.
Lauren, I'm sorry,
yeah.
There's another question asking, can we do this as a state agency?
I'm not sure what you mean by that. Can we do this as a state agency? So
this came from Joanne Comstock, who works for one of the LMHAs, who's it's a state operated LMHA. I believe the state operated LMHA cannot be the sponsor. In your case, Joanne, it would either be the Connection, who owns Liberty Commons, or St. Vincent de Paul, who provides the case management services. It would probably be the Connection or the Connection Fund that would in turn then become the sponsor. And they are sponsors for one of the other grants we have. Mansour, you might remember the name of it. I can't off the top of my head, but they are currently a sponsor of one of the programs, one of the grants.
So the LMHA would continue to be involved in the way that they're currently involved, right? So the LMHA would continue, DEMIS would continue to be the grantee, and the LMHA would continue to pay the subsidized portion of the rent to the nonprofit sponsor in the SRA model. But as Alice said, the sponsor has to be a nonprofit. So the nonprofit would serve as the sponsor. So the next question is, how does an eviction work under the SRA model? So I guess the landlord could certainly evict you, right, as the leaseholder, right? The landlord could say, I no longer want to have this. It's not exactly an eviction, but the landlord could say, I no longer want to have this contractual relationship with you as the sponsoring entity, right? And you could also, and I believe the landlord could also, I'm not a housing attorney, so I think that question I want to look into a little more before I answer. But I believe the landlord could also probably force an eviction of the subtenant, and you could also pursue removal of the subtenant. But let me get back to you with details on that, because I'm not entirely certain how that all works. All right. So I think we've gotten to all the questions so far in the chat box. And the next slide looks at, so one of the things that we're trying to do through this is to increase housing choices, for our participants, right? And so some of these things are already options that you have. And then the last one is a new option that would open up if you chose to do a conversion, right? So the first situation that's here on this slide is that you've got some tenants, right? A lot of these buildings have been around for a very long time, and you've got some folks that have lived there for a very long time, and they're really pretty independent, right? They really don't use case management much. And a lot of times they would like to move on out of the building, live somewhere else. But what's stopping them is that they need the rent subsidy in order to pay their rent, right? So in that case, regardless of whether you stay PRA or you become SRA, right, you can help them to move on, by connecting them with some sort of mainstream housing voucher, right? Or, rarely, but sometimes you've got folks that, get enough employment income or come into some money and they can self-pay, right? But generally it's going to be connecting somebody to some sort of mainstream subsidized housing option. So that could be the DOH moving on voucher program. It could be public housing if such a thing exists in your community. It could be a housing choice voucher if available. Usually people have to get on a wait list for quite a long time. But there is in the new ARP, the American Rescue Plan that got passed by Congress and signed into law by President Biden last week, there are $5 billion with a B additional dollars for tenant-based rental assistance that is going to be administered through your public housing authorities. So you do want to make sure if you're a place that has a public housing authority in your area that you serve, and you've got people who want to move on from your PSH, regardless of what kind of PSH it is, you do want to make sure that you are keeping in touch with your housing, with your PHA about what's going to happen with those vouchers, because there are going to be new vouchers hitting the streets, and you want to make sure that you get people in line to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. So that's a significant opportunity that is going to be available to people shortly. The second option on this slide is you've got somebody living at your congregate project that, maybe doesn't really want to live at the congregate project yet, still would rather have their own unit, scattered site unit in the community. But they still need some services, right? They like the support, they like their case manager, they want to stay in your PSH project, they just don't want to live in the building anymore. So in that case, if you've got the eligibility documentation that's necessary, right? You can document that that person, met what is now the dedicated plus criteria, which is what is required for any new entry now into a PSH project, right? That if you've got enough homelessness and the disability documentation that you need from project entry, then regardless of whether or not you can convert to SRA, you can transfer that person now through your CAN to a TRA project, right? And the CAN will backfill the resulting vacancy in your congregate project with a person who meets the dedicated plus criteria and has been prioritized as being vulnerable and needing PSH. So that's an option that is available regardless of whether or not you convert. The third option on this slide is only going to be available if you convert. So, and this is an option that you could consider for someone who, again, lives at your congregate facility, wants some level of services to continue, but would like to move out of the building and to a scattered site unit, and you don't have adequate documentation that would allow them to transfer to a new project. In that case, you can keep them in your project, right? So that they're not moving projects. So the eligibility criteria that apply would be whatever the eligibility criteria that you entered them in. So like maybe they came in, 15 years ago before chronic homelessness was even a thing, and you have documentation that they were homeless, right? But you don't have documentation that would enable you to transfer them over to a new project. So if that's the case, then you can have them stay in the SRA project, but move them to a scattered site unit if you've got the funds that are available to enable them to move. So things that you want to think about here. All right, let's see, we've got questions. So let me look at the questions before.
So I think we are, what happens when SRA has a property management and they decline clients based on background check?
So that's not, so the property manager, whether it's an SRA or a PRA, right? The property manager works for the nonprofit organization, right? So that property manager is not like this independent entity that gets to do whatever they want. They work for you, not you, Neelam, but the nonprofit, right? And they are required to follow the Housing First. I'll speak for CT Boss, right? Because that, I can't speak for ODFC. But in CT Boss, we require that all projects are housing first. And that means that the property manager in the congregate project has got to follow the housing first standards. And I know I can say that, right? And it's easy for me to say, and it's hard in practice to actually get your property managers doing that. But I can tell you that over the course of the years that we have been monitoring, we have seen significant progress in that area where property managers have changed because the entity that they're working for has told them that, look, you have to change this or we're going to seek a different property manager. And that we've been able to align property management practices more and more with the housing first model. Now, if what you're asking, Neelam, and I've misunderstood your question, is not about a congregate situation, but about a scattered site situation, right? Where the property manager works for Joe landlord out in the community, that we have no control over, right? That's all of the good kind of negotiation that that you guys all do with landlords to get somebody into one of those units. But where the property manager is at a congregate project that's owned by a nonprofit, it really is advocacy by that nonprofit with the property manager to get them aligned with the housing first model. That's what the expectation is.
Yep. Lauren, a kind of follow up on that. What language do we use for the property manager to take a client based on housing first principles?
So we are happy to arm you. What I would say is please please reach out to me and I will send you whatever you need, right? It says in your project application to HUD, right, that you are going to operate this project in accordance with the housing first principles. And that means that the property manager that you have hired is required to do that. And if you're not doing that, it's going to be a monitoring risk. Both, if we come out and monitor, that's going to be a finding. And if HUD comes out and monitors, that's going to be a finding. You are not in compliance with your grant if that is not what you are doing. And I'm happy to give you whatever language is needed. Just email me after and I can, pass along. We've got the CT Boss housing first principles that are in CT Boss policies, and we can also, show you where in the HUD application you've said that you are going to be doing this, and we can whatever you need, we're happy to provide you with that language.
Yep. Just one other question. So it says, I assume the landlord has to approve the subleasing and or approve subleasing.
I'm not sure actually about that, whether or not the landlord has to approve the subleasing. I think once you've signed the contract with the landlord, I think that probably depends upon the terms of your lease with the landlord, whether or not the landlord has any ability to be able to approve the subleasing or not. I mean, we certainly know of lots of COC programs nationally that use, because the master leasing model is the same model that's used in leasing projects. And it's a way that many COCs are housing people who are not able to get a lease normally with a landlord because they're not getting a lease with the landlord, they're getting a sublease with you. So Susie, I don't know if you, because you've done master leasing, have you guys had to have the subleases approved through the landlord?
Depends on the landlord.
Yeah.
The landlords that, well, the landlords that understood what a master lease was wrote that in and would only give it to us. We had to have the discussion of, a basically housing first model, and that these would be more fragile, more difficult people, but they would have strong case management. So it was a lot of advocacy on our part. So it really depended upon the landlord. But I would say 50-50 transition to 75-25 over time.
Great. Thanks.
So it really needed to be somebody who was graduating from we weren't putting housing first people into those necessarily because they were going through other systems first.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think the higher need people are probably going to do better in your congregate project, right? Because there's a higher level of services generally in the congregate project. So, you know, I think that is, you know, probably the strategy that you want to use, right? You're going to put your higher need people in the congregate project, and then you're going to, as people no longer need that level of service, move them to a scattered site unit, whether it's within your project or another unit that exists in a different grant in your community. So Carmen, I see you said you'd like to add to the PM conference, so feel free to unmute.
Sure. Thank you so much. And sure. I know that Neelam was the person that did ask the question, and exactly to your point that we hire the property management company as that nonprofit as an owner. Therefore, one of the things that I always do for all my projects, and of course, you know, this has taken some training over the course of the years, is that everything is in accordance to housing first. And we advocate on behalf of our clients. And I make sure that our property managers are aligned with what we want through our housing first model. And if Neelam, if you ever run into that problem with our buildings, please make sure that I know about that, because I will intervene immediately.
Great, thank you. That's super helpful. It's always super helpful to hear folks from the field that have already doing this stuff to chime in. So please, we invite you to do that. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the rest of the points on this slide. So the first thing that you want to consider is obviously whether or not you've got enough money to be able to do this, right? And so when you look at your grant, right, you can see, you know, generally, how much money are we leaving on the table every year, right? And if there's enough money that you're leaving on the table consistently to lease at least one other unit for a year, then, you know, this is something that you might want to consider doing. If you've got a very small PRA project, then there might not be enough money on the table to be able to afford to lease another unit. If you've got multiple PRA projects, you can consider consolidating those projects into a single PRA project, which has a lot of advantages beyond just more flexibility in the budget. It also significantly reduces your administrative burdens, right? You only have to do one project application, you only have to do one contract, you only have to do one technical submission, one APR. So that's a thing to consider if you've got multiple smaller PRAs. But so that's the first thing, is to look at, do I have enough money here to even be able to lease another unit? The next thing, of course, is that you're still going to have to provide services to anyone that remains in your PSH project and would now be living potentially in a scattered site housing unit. So that would be you know, I think a lot of you already have scattered site housing units that you're servicing anyway. So I think it's easier to do that if you already have an existing scattered site program, you know, to have a couple other people getting services in the community and not just in your congregate building. And then the last thing is that, you know, Alice and the team at DEMIS are going to work with you guys, you know, to try to make sure that if you want to do this, that you're not overcommitting financially. But we also know that things can change, right? So it could be that currently you've got a lot of people with income in your building and you've got enough money to do this. And then you have a lot of turnover and you get people that don't have any income in your building and now you don't have the money available. So DEMIS is going to work with you to make sure, you know, that if it looks like now that you're going to do this and 3 years from now, the money is no longer sufficient, DEMIS will work with you because DEMIS has a much larger portfolio of projects that they can tap in order to move people between projects and if needed, to make sure that the participants that you've leased for in the community stay housed and that your congregate project continues to be able to get subsidies for all of your units. So it's that is going to be a pain and it's going to be complicated. So you really want to make sure up front that you're determining that you've got enough money to do this before you head down that path. And then the other thing that I don't know that I said earlier, but I just want to reinforce is that if you convert to SRA, it's not like tenant-based rental assistance where the tenant has a right under the, you know, the HUD rules to, you know, move to a different unit if they want, right? It doesn't have that same stipulation in the HUD rules. It allows you to be able to do this, right? But if you determine at some point, so let's say you do this and you think you have enough money to have, you know, one person move and, you know, that somebody moves, and then you don't have enough money to continue to do that, right? You don't have to allow every single person that lives in your building to move if they want to move, right? It's contingent on the availability of funding. It's an option, but not, the tenant doesn't necessarily have the right to do it, and if the money isn't there to do it.
So Lauren, I just wanted to really quickly, right, it is all a balancing act of who has income, how much income, you know, people moving, security deposits, et cetera, being taken out of grants. So I'm going to just put another plug in for our annual spending tracker, which, you know, you guys all, the housing coordinators all have. And so it really does help you project out for the year how much extra you might have or how much you're overspending. And so, of course, and, you know, I hope everyone, all the housing coordinators and supervisors on the call know that, you know, we at Office of the Commissioner, Brenda, Lisa, and I are always happy to walk through the expenditures with you, figure out if you have enough. I mean, in some cases, you're also, because if you have extra money and you want to house someone and all your units in the building are efficiencies, but you have enough money to house someone who needs a 2-bedroom you can do that. You're no longer bound, as long as you're meeting the initial obligation to HUD of housing the, you know, say 20 people in the building, and you have funding enough to house somebody who needs a 2-bedroom, you can do that. So there's a lot more flexibility, but it is about making sure that you have the money to do so, and to do so for, you know, a period of time.
Great, thank you, Alice.
So Lauren, we have a question. If we're leaving money on the table, what can we do to use the funds for operations, especially when the project does not have enough funds for operations?
Yeah, so unfortunately, this is, you know, in the COC regulations, there is a prohibition against combining rental assistance and operating dollars in the same project. So HUD believes that the amount of money that is, you know, that's what FMR is, right? So FMR is meant to fully cover your costs, and that's how these projects are budgeted, based on FMR. So that does not change. So regardless of whether you're a PRA or an SRA, if you are getting any type of rental assistance, it's not like a leasing project. So in a leasing project, you can have an operating line in addition to the leasing line, but in a PRA or an SRA project, that is prohibited by HUD. So operating is not an eligible expense if you've got rental assistance dollars in either PRA or SRA.
And all of these projects are rental assistance. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that.
Yeah.
So we have another, our contracts for our 2 PRAs, one HUD through DOH with us as a subrecipient and one HUD funded us to the subsidy, are committed to number of units. We do not have a budget, as that is in the hands of DOH. So the extra funds are in DOH's hands, correct?
Okay. So if DOH is the recipient of the grant, right, they are doing the drawdowns, they are getting the money from HUD. And so I'm not sure you mean by, yeah, so I think the answer to your question is yes, but I don't think that that necessarily precludes you from doing this, right? It's the same situation as with Demas, right? It changes who has to do the grant agreement amendment, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But other than that, I don't think it changes your ability to be able to do this. You would have to work with DOH to figure out how much money you have available rather than with Alice and her team at Demas to figure that out. But otherwise, I think, Steve has been part of these conversations, knows that we're doing this on the Demas side, and I think would be open to also doing this for any PSH projects for which they are the recipient. Alice, jump in if you think I'm missing something here.
Right. No, I agree. And even though DOH is the recipient of the funds, just like Demas is a recipient of the PRA and SRA and TRA funds that we're talking about here, the sort of nice thing about that tracking sheet, and Susie, if you need it, I can get it to you, is you can enter your own, what you know about that project, right? So like the amount of money that goes to rental assistance, how much each tenant is responsible to pay, how much each of the rental subsidies is it, and so it projects out for the whole grant year. It's actually, I just want to send a shout out to the housing coordinator, the Demas housing coordinators who helped put this all together. It was a bunch of people who worked on it together, and so it can be used universally for the projects. I saw you asked to send it. I will send it out, Susie. It's a good tool. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, and I've been tracking that on our units in an Excel spreadsheets, but if there's something better, I always want something better. But my question also is, really our contract is for 21 units and 11 units. There's no dollar, and then FMR for 21 units and 11 units. So we're treated in that contract as a landlord. So maybe the other end is but anyway, and J. D'Amelia does their thing and we get the money. So that's why I was saying, all 3 of our buildings, I don't see any extra funds that we could spend. So that means I need to go talk to DOH to say, are there?
So there may be some underspending in the building because tenants are paying rent, right? And so the subsidy isn't needed to cover the entire cost of the unit because tenants are contributing rent. That's the biggest reason why this happens.
But what I'm saying is, if a tenant is paying $300, so that $3,600 a year for that apartment is staying at DOH to go somewhere else. We're not drawing it down. So we don't have a limit.
A tenant is living in your building and the tenant is cutting their share of the rent to DOH and not.
No, they're paying their rent to us, but we get a subsidy for the difference.
Okay, so that money, I get what you're saying. So that money.
So the leftover money is at DOH, not from, I mean, they're 2 different contracts because one is state funded and one is Fed funded, but.
It's the same arrangement as on the DEMA side, if I'm understanding correctly, Alice. So it's just figuring out, if you don't already know what the underspending is, it's using the tool that Alice is offering
Okay,
and having a conversation with Steve's team at DOH about how much money is being left on the table and whether or not they want to, whether or not they want you to be able to consider this option. And I suspect if there's enough money, they will, because they want as many PSH units as they can get.
Great.
So the other question I think I see here is, once you convert from PRA to SRA and for some reason it does not work in a few years, will it be possible to convert back to PRA? The answer to that is yes, you can always convert back, but I don't know why you would, right? Because you can be an SRA and just not use the scattered site leasing option, right? If you decide it's not working out and you don't want to do the scattered site piece anymore, then just stop doing it. As people, as people turn over, just stop leasing those new units and you can stay in SRA, and that doesn't change what happens in your congregate project, right? Does that make sense to you, Alice? Yeah. So you could if you wanted to, but I don't think there's any advantage to you in converting back. So I don't think you would even have to bother. All right, I think that's all the questions. So I'm gonna go back to the slides here. So other things you wanna consider, I just said this, right? So you're not gonna change the number of people in your project application. So as the question that we just had came up, right? If you decide for whatever reason, there's no longer enough money, the organization has decided that it doesn't work for you, right? Then you can always go back to the original number of people that you are serving because you didn't commit in your project application to serve more. So as those scattered site units turn over, just don't refill them, right? And then I think we said this before. Also, you don't have to worry about having vacancies in your congregate project because the CAN is going to backfill any vacancies in that congregate project through the usual by name list process. So none of that changes. All right. So Liz, can you get do you see the question from Mansour? Yeah, so Liz will put the renewal of the specific renewal evaluation criteria in the chat box, Mansour, for you. And once it gets up there, I'll share it with everyone else. Do we have anybody that's on the phone that can't see the chat, Liz, or is everybody on Zoom? Let me look. I think everybody's on Zoom, so everybody should be able to read the response in the chat. Okay. How does this conversion affect the environmental reviews? Good question, Neelam. So I think it doesn't affect, well, I mean, it affects the environmental reviews in that for the scattered site units that you're leasing, right, you would have to do the, if you're in a coastal county, you would have to do the coastal barrier resource unit mapping piece, just like any other scattered site unit that you're renting. So you would need to attach to the existing, the review that the project-based projects are doing, the environmental review that's required for the congregate projects is a higher level of review than is required for the scattered site projects. So there's everything that's in that you would have to do for the scattered site projects is already in what you've done for the congregate projects, with the exception of that coastal barrier resource mapping thing, which is fairly straightforward. And there's an FAQ up on the CT Boss website that explains what you have to, do there. But the general environmental review requirement is going to be the same, right? It's at least you have to renew it for at least every 5 years.
Great. And just a heads up, Alice put the tool in the chat box. So it's there for folks. And if anybody's having trouble accessing it, shoot me a note. We're happy to get it to you. And I also put the housing first principles. I put the boss policies in there, and housing first principles are there.
And also, thanks, Liz, if you know, there's data filled out in those tracking sheets, but it's not real. You know, it's like says J Doe and things like that. So if you need or have questions on how to use it, feel free to reach out to me. It's pretty, once you get it, it's pretty intuitive, but you know, there might be some questions.
Okay. So I think we've gotten to all the questions in the chat. So I'm going to just walk us through next steps. So the next step really is for you to go back to, you know, whomever at your agency is going to make this decision, you know, and consider whether or not this is something you think is going to work for your tenants and your agency. And then Alice is asking that you guys get back to her in about a month by April 16th to let her know whether or not you are going to move ahead and seek a conversion for your project or projects. And if you're not going to seek a conversion, why you think it's not going to work for you. So why you think it makes sense for your project to remain PRA. So again, if you can get that information to Alice by the 16th of next month. And then I
just wanna-
go ahead.
Oh, so for some of you, you might need to work with your partners. So, you know, the connection, I don't believe I saw on the call. So you might at River Valley Services need to reach out to the connection because they will be. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. Sorry.
No
Thank you.
problem.
Thanks for jumping in.
Yes.
All right, let me use another part of the. Actually, I see New Haven. I don't think New Haven is on the call. So, you know, New Haven would have to reach out to the owners or a sponsor and, you know, a private nonprofit and see if they wanted to, you know, work with them to discuss this as an option. So sometimes, you know, some of it might be who's on the call and some of it might be you have to reach out to your nonprofit partner.
So, and then I think most of you are, almost all of our PSH and CT boss anyway is Demas is the recipient. So I think for Susie, this would have to be DOH this next point, right? Whoever the recipient is, for most of you, it's going to be Demas. They would work with HUD to request this as a contract amendment. So Alice has already done a lot, and I should have started by thanking Alice for all that she has done to move this ball down the court with the state partners and with the HUD office. So Alice has done a lot of work behind the scenes to get all of the partners aligned to be able to make this happen. And so CHAFA is already on board with this. So if you have any concerns about CHAFA, do not fear. Alice has handled that. If you have, and Alice has also had preliminary conversations with the HUD field office to confirm the process by which this would be done, which is a grant agreement amendment, right? So, so Alice and her team, and will help out, will submit the request to HUD to make that grant agreement amendment. I'm sure there's going to be information that Alice is going to need from you. She'll let you know what information she needs from you. And then HUD will have to approve this and execute the grant agreement amendment with Demas. And then once that happens, the recipient, mostly Demas, maybe DOH, in a couple of cases, would notify you of the effective date of the change. So the important thing to keep in mind here is that you can't decide that you're going to do this and just go ahead and do it without a grant agreement amendment, right? Because it's not, those scattered site units are not going to be an eligible expense on your contract until you have that grant agreement amendment. So don't move forward until you hear from Alice that that grant agreement amendment has been executed. So, and then I think that that is it. That's all the content that we had to share with you. This is my contact information and Alice's contact information, which I think all of you already have. And this is all the contact information for the Housing Innovation COC support team.
We have another question, Lauren. So we have a PRA where the building owner is also the service provider. Would another entity need to hold the leases if we change to SRA?
No, I mean, the building owner and the service provider, like you could, I mean, I think you would want in practice, like we always, one of the things that's in the Housing First Principles really is, you know, trying to delineate the case management from the housing coordination function in your building. So we certainly would not suggest that the case manager, you know, be the person that collects the rent or, you know, handles lease violations or any of that. But you can do that. Your agency, you know, as is currently the case, right, is both the owner of the building and the landlord and the service provider organization. You just want to sort of delineate those two functions as much as possible among different staff within your agency, but there's nothing to prevent your agency from doing that currently under the PRA model or under the new SRA model. Great. Other questions people have? All right, if you guys have more questions, when you go back and start to chew this over about what it's going to mean and compile your response that you're going to submit by April 16th to Alice, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or to Alice. And if we don't know the answer to your question, we will find out and get you the answer. I have one unanswered question, I think, just on my list, which is how does the eviction process work for the scattered site unit? So we'll look into that and get that back out by email to the list that we used for this webinar. Are there other questions that people still have that you want us to either answer now or look into? All right. Thank you, everyone. Alice, was there anything else you wanted to say before I?
No, again, I just really appreciate you guys taking the time. If I put it in the chat, but if you have questions, you know, reach out to Lauren and myself. You know, I think I really want to appreciate Lauren and Liz and Miles and Howard, who've also done a lot behind the scenes to help us move this down the track. As Lauren said, we really don't want to return any money to HUD if at all possible. So, you know, thanks everybody.
All right. Take good care, guys, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.